This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Why do we fall so hard for some people so quickly? Why does love feel intoxicating at first, but become increasingly complicated over time? And why do so many of our deepest relationship struggles feel both intensely personal and strangely universal? The answer may lie in something that we don't talk enough about, which is that humans are animals. We're highly intelligent, technologically sophisticated animals, of course, but we're animals nonetheless. And our brains carry the imprint of mating systems that evolved long before dating apps, marriage certificates, and modern culture as we know it. Humans evolved powerful systems for attachment, desire, jealousy, bonding, and novelty, and those systems helped our ancestors to survive and reproduce, but they also created deep tensions between stability and excitement, between loyalty and temptation, and between long-term partnership and short-term attraction. So what does it mean to be an intimate animal? And how much of our modern lives are being shaped by ancient mating systems? That's what we're going to be talking about in this show. My guest today is Dr. Justin Garcia, an evolutionary biologist and the executive director of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. He is the chief scientific advisor for Match and author of the new book, The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Hi, Justin, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Justin. I'm thrilled to be here with you, always.
Well, it's always great to have you here, and congratulations on the new book. I know it was a very long time coming.
Yes, it was a long project, and it changed as I was writing it, as my part of, and it's in the book, but my own personal experiences with love and sex and intimacy and connection changed. And that's a through line throughout. But this was a few years in the making, and I'm excited to be able to share it with everyone.
Well, we're excited to talk about it. And it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend that everyone read it. So you call humans intimate animals. So let's start there. What do you mean by that? And what makes intimacy such a defining feature of our species from an evolutionary perspective?
Yeah, thanks. So I think a lot when we think about our sexual lives, and including our work and work we do at the Kinsey Institute, in my lab, and our colleagues do, when I think about our sexual lives, I've often been interested in the relationship context of our sexual lives. Now, that can mean a lot of things. It could mean no relationship context. It's solo behavior. It could mean one long-term partner, short-term partners, managing multiple partners. I'm not, I don't have a particular stake in what those relationship structures look like. And in fact, the interesting thing about humans is that they look and feel and are experienced in so many different dimensions. But I've always been interested in how we understand our sex lives playing out in those different, in the context, the ecology of our sex lives, relationship ecology. So why I think we're the intimate animal is that when we start to think of that and we think of how people's romantic and sexual lives are experienced in different environments, in different cultural contexts, we can apply an evolutionary lens and we start to see some similar patterns of how we are like, and in some ways unlike, but how we're like other mammals. So we know, for instance, that about 3 to 5% of mammals engage in social monogamy, about 15% of primates. And humans do that. But the fact that we have the capacity for it, the fact that we have the architecture in our brain to fall deeply in love with someone, and that love can shape what our sexual life looks like. And in fact, in our studies, people report that the more in love they are with someone, the better satisfaction they have in their sexual life. Those were some of the early kernels for me to start to say, well, how do we understand the tension and the alignment, in the best cases, between our romantic and sexual desires? And for me, I wanted this lens of, well, and how does it fit into the natural world was the next question. How do we compare to those other 3 to 5% of mammals? How do we compare to other primates? Why is it that 90% of birds form monogamous bonds? There's a genetic story there. And so I was really trying to understand that landscape. And throughout, I've always been interested in, I think a lot of us are interested in this idea of human nature. And sometimes we pull examples from the natural world But some of those examples are just kind of bonk. And what happens when we really look at some of the evidence? I was, as an example, you and I have talked about this. As an example, I was somewhere not long ago, and someone in the audience was asking me about alpha males and alpha wolf. And I was like, as someone who studies the connections between intimacy and sex, there really isn't an alpha male wolf. And they were kind of upset. They're like, yes, there is. I said, no, there's an alpha couple. There's a pair that leads a wolf pack. And they're usually family units. And I think that's just a quick, easy example. We've all heard this example. It's this idea of the alpha male wolf. And it's, when you actually look at the natural world, there's a more nuanced story there. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it has to do about couching, dominance, mating, social behavior in these sort of social structures that we exist in. So what's the human-animal social structure? That's the backstory of everything I was trying to rip apart.
As you were talking there, it reminded me of a conversation I had with Dr. Nathan Lentz on the show a little while back. And we were talking about, what we can learn about ourselves from animals and how, people have this tendency when they see animal sexual and mating behavior, we have a tendency to see what we want to see in that. And we can use that to create justifications for why we are the way that we are. And so it's one of those things where I think there's a lot we can learn by looking at other species, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that we do bring some biases to the table when we're trying to interpret, well, what are animals doing and why, and what does that mean for us? Yeah,
and Nathan's book's really good at that. I reviewed it and I really enjoyed his book. And I think there's other biologists, Marlene Zook, Nathan Lentz. There's a handful of folks who have really thought about how we can use these examples, but we have to be cautious. And I think one of the things that comes out of that is also a reminder that humans evolve for a particular ecology. And we have, exactly as you're saying, Justin, we have a tendency to want to say, well, how do we compare to chimps? Or aren't we like bonobos in our mating behavior? And we're not chimps, we're not bonobos, we're not gorillas. Each of those species, including humans, had their own evolutionary legacy. So when we take a comparative approach, we can't just cherry pick the one that we like or say, well, this one is somewhat genetically related to us. We really have to say, well, what was going on in these different ecologies? How did you adapt to different environments? We are humans and we have our own natural history and legacy. But we can borrow from those examples to understand how mating behavior or sex and relationships and social behavior adapt to different environments.
Yeah, makes sense to me. So something you talk about in the book is how humans evolved a strong pair bonding system. And we also evolved at the same time a desire for novelty and newness. And on the surface, those things would seem to have some tension with one another, which is why there's this perennial debate about whether humans were meant for monogamy or non-monogamy. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how those two systems can coexist within the same brain and what your take is on that big question of, are we monogamous or non-monogamous by nature?
Yeah, we're going to solve the world's questions today. And so it is a question, and it's a question that all of us as researchers still grapple with, and understanding the tensions and the sort of natural history of who we are. So one of the things early on in my career, because I've been fortunate to work with so many psychologists and sociologists and people using different disciplines and theories on how they understand sexuality and relationships, something from my training as an evolutionary biologist was that I never talked about monogamy in the sense of in the way that we often do in the public or in popular conversation. This idea that there's just monogamy is one thing, that are couples monogamous, is a person monogamous. As a biologist, we separate social monogamy, which is that pair bond, and sexual monogamy, which is fidelity. And they're two different mechanisms in the brain. So we understand that some of what's happening for why we pair bond, why we form attached romantic love, biologists characterize the social monogamy is mutual territory defense, mutual nest building, mutual raising of offspring. A lot of that mutual piece there, this idea that you have a co-CEO that you're experiencing life with. And that's a different question from fidelity, from sexual monogamy. Now, in a lot of our observations of animals throughout the world, those that form socially monogamous pair bonds try to maintain sexual exclusivity. There's things like mate guarding and jealousy, and and you see all of that play out in the natural world, and we certainly see it play out in humans, that there's a tendency to try and maintain exclusivity with your partner. But we've also evolved this desire for sexual novelty. And that, for me, is evolutionarily a really interesting landscape, because it says, okay, about a little over 4 million years ago, our ancestors evolved the capacity for pair bonding, for forming intense romantic bonds. That's one lever. And there was selection pressure on that. And there's mechanisms that we understand about that, about our physiology. But that there was another lever, at the same time, simultaneous selection pressure for sexual novelty. Mm-hmm. So then these two levers at times are in conflict with each other, because you have this desire and this adaptive desire to form an intense pair bond, but then also to seek these new things. And when you seek those new things, it could cause a problem for your long-term relationship. So I think what that to me says is that then we can start to think about this issue of social monogamy and what are we adapted for and what are our possibilities, in a way that, okay, we form these intense bonds, and this helps explain why we see relatively high rates of infidelity in some people. And because they're looking for that sexual novelty and that variation, it also explains why some people can open their relationships in interesting ways, and it works really well because they can get the sexual novelty and still have their desires for pair bonds. And then it can also explain why some people who don't want to do one of those first two things, that they can take this desire for sexual novelty and try to pull it into their primary relationship. Mm-hmm. So when we know we have these two levers, we could say, hey, I need my fix somehow. One of these three possible options, we need to talk about one of them in some ways. And that maybe is you and your partner do new things sexually, or you travel, or you pull the desire for novelty into your primary bond. Or we can get serious about saying, I need it somewhere. And if we don't talk about it, maybe the infidelity piece is going to happen. And the problem with infidelity, of course, is the idea that it's non-consensual. It's a betrayal. And you start to damage the primary relationship. So I am, in some ways, agnostic to what people decide on those. I don't have a moral view on what people decide. But when we recognize that that tension is there, then we could start to say, okay, how in our relationships today can we be serious about cultivating one of those options? Ideally, I think the opening the relationship or pulling the desire for novelty into your primary relationship are the quote-unquote consensual ones. Mm-hmm. The other one is more challenging for all sorts of ways. So
I really like the way you describe that, because maybe the answer to this question isn't that we're wired for monogamy or non-monogamy. It's not an either-or question, mm-hmm. but we have these fundamental underlying systems in the brain for pair bonding and novelty and newness, and they can be channeled in a lot of different directions. So mm-hmm. I think that's maybe a more helpful way of thinking about this question.
Yeah, and I think it helps make sense of when we look around, when we look at the world. Let's just take the United States and some data that we've both worked on and studies that we've looked at, that how do we explain the diversity of relationship structures that work for a lot of people, but also the tensions that we see somewhat universally, regardless of your relationship structure, things about jealousy, things about maintaining connection with partners, typically primary partners. It gives us a different landscape, a different lens that I find helpful of thinking through the dynamics in people's romantic and sexual lives, and everything from questions of love to questions of sexual desire and sexual variety.
Yeah, and there is so much diversity in the natural world, including mm-hmm. in the human world. Yeah. So having some way to explain why different people seem to want different things is very helpful and useful. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about love. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people, including the late Dr. Helen Fisher, mm-hmm. describe love as being addictive. Mm-hmm. And I get why they say that. But is love really an addiction in the clinical sense? What's your take on that? And what's actually happening in the brain when we fall in love with someone?
Yeah, I love that you bring this up. And I think as sexologists, we're so careful about this notion of addiction because sex addiction has been deployed in a way that's
not good,
not good. Yeah, not helpful, not good, misunderstood. And the challenge then is people will seek treatments for addiction that doesn't really help with compulsive or out of control sexual lives. So I often find myself so cautious about thinking about love and addiction because there's that other piece of, let's also talk about sex addiction as a challenging concept. But with love, there's something kind of interesting. I think that we all have a tendency to think of addiction with a negative valence, that it's problematic, and so often it is. But there are characteristics of romantic love that look quite a lot like addiction, and that's both from fMRI brain studies and behavioral. So I'm always a bit cautious. I'm always on the fence of using the term addiction because it's so loaded. But there is an awful lot when we look. And in fact, in studies of people who have gone through romantic rejection, who were put in an fMRI brain scanner, they have regions of the brain still with attachment, regions of the brain still associated with romantic attraction, like the ventral tegmental area and the dopamine systems. But they also have regions of the brain that look remarkably like someone going through drug withdrawal. So that does tell us something about love bonds and their intensity and the craving that comes with it that is different than sexual behavior. That there's this desire there's a craving with romantic love, but there's also this future-looking reward. Because a lot of the dopamine systems, as you know, are really about these future possibility of reward.
It's the anticipation.
Exactly. So these anticipatory networks for dopamine, it's a neurotransmitter that's really more, when people talk about dopamine as a pleasure circuit, it's really a lot more about anticipation, as you've written about, you know this. So I think as we think about romantic love, there are so many elements that do look like addiction, but in a positively valenced sense. But at the same time, withdrawal of romantic bonds looks something like addiction as well. So I'm a little cautious. I'm hedging. I know I'm not giving a good answer because I'm hedging so much. But I think there's quite a lot of evidence that there's something unique going on with pair bonds, unlike a behavior. Because unlike sexual behavior or a sexual event or even the desire for that, pair bonds are also linked into our social networks in all sorts of ways. So even when we use these brain studies, the hard part is, okay, we put someone in a brain scanner and we look at who we show them their beloved and we see what happens and what lights up in their brain, which tells us where oxygenated blood is going. The part that we don't necessarily pick up on is, I show you a picture of your romantic partner. There's also history and stories and social networks, and there's all sorts of other stuff that we process when we see our romantic partners. You look at them and you go, I remember that terrible fight we had, and where I lost some trust in you. But I also remember that time that I fell in love with you. And I remember that time that you took care of me when I was sick. And I remember that trip we took with our best friends. So whatever we see in these brain scan studies, or even in social psychological studies, it's tied to this network. And I think that's the part that makes this distinction of what we really experience with love, with romantic bonding, really complicated to break apart. There's a lot of stuff going on psychologically, neurobiologically. And increasingly, we understand the physiology of those connections. We talk about oxytocin a lot with romantic bonds, the so-called cuddle hormone. It's a neuropeptide, but we also understand that it's really tied, this is the work of our colleague Sue Carter, that oxytocin is really tied to the immune system. So for instance, studies looking at wound healing, if you have high levels of oxytocin, your wounds heal faster. So then we get into these bigger discussions of, is love really the best medicine? Well, there's a kind of a physiology that it actually is tied to. So when we pull those bonds away, we know that people experience physical pain. We know that they feel the withdrawal of this desired person. But when we introduce it, there's also this sense of euphoria. So romantic love is, I think, so interesting. And for so long, researchers have danced around it. And in terms of, how do you really study it? Is it a soft concept? How do you really define it? Elaine Hatfield, the social psychologist, spent her whole career really trying to say, we can make a real science out of this. And at times was attacked. It was attacked by U.S. Congress over it. She received the Proxmire Award for absurd government spending for studying romantic love as a core element of what it means to be human. So anyway, I'll start professing too much.
Well, I mean, yes, there's a lot in what you said in terms of, how some have trivialized the experience of love, but by the same token, it is so important, so fundamental, so vital to our lives in so many ways. But I think it's also important to recognize too that different people seem to experience love in somewhat different ways. So I just did a couple of recent episodes with Dr. Tom Bellamy, and we were talking all about the neuroscience of limerence and how it seems that only half the population actually experiences limerence as the early stages of love. And so to me, I find that to be really fascinating that for some people, they can have love as this really intense, overwhelming, all-consuming type of thing, whereas for others, it's much more of a slow burn and a gradual build. And I guess I'm curious, what do you think accounts for the fact that there's also this diversity in the nature and the way we experience love?
Yeah, and I love that. I love that finding. I saw you writing and talking about it, and I think that also helps to talk about your other episode on it. I think it also helps us understand when we can feel like there's a mismatch. And, don't you feel the way I feel? Don't you feel the intensity that I feel? It's like, maybe I don't. And that's not necessarily about you. It just could be about what my capacity for experiencing is. So one of the fun things about being an evolutionary biologist is we talk about diversity so much in sex research and relationship research. Diversity of relationship structures, diversity of sexual orientations, diversity of sexual interests, diversity of sexual desires. You have a very good book on this. And we, as an evolutionist, diversity is a feature. It's not a bug. And sometimes we have a tendency to really want to explain, is all the diversity adaptive? Like, all the theories on sexual orientation, and is homosexuality adaptive, is bisexuality adaptive, is flexibility adaptive, sexual flexibility adaptive. There are very interesting arguments to be made there. But the other part of an evolutionary framework is the diversity itself, the variation itself is a key ingredient to evolutionary process. So when I look at a landscape of a behavior and see all this variation, the fact that the variation exists is telling and is important. And it's adaptive in the sense that sometimes a population needs variation. I'm going to use a non-mating example. In studies, this is my old PhD advisor, David Sloan Wilson and Ann Clark did these studies on fish, on I think they did initially on bluegill, sunfish. In a pond, you can have shy fish and bold fish. And the bold fish are the ones that come in the shallow water to get more nutrients, but they have a higher likelihood of being depredated, of being eaten by a bird. The shy fish will stay more in the bottom of the pond, so they have different access to food resources, but they also have different risks for depredation, of being killed. And they sometimes can start to look differently. They have different morphologies. They have different, what we call behavioral syndromes, what's sometimes called personalities. In the biological literature, it's usually called a behavioral syndrome. And so, but that is adaptive, and maintaining a frequency of those different personalities is adaptive. So for me, so much of the variation in our romantic and sexual lives is itself a story about we are a species that has done well with some selection for variation, for shyness, for boldness, for and any number of dimensions. That's also an important part of the evolutionary story of understanding how we have the capacity. Because we do, right? That's the challenge when we apply these biological frameworks. But the big question is always, but what about all the variation? Not everyone fits in that. And to your point on limerence, not everyone fits in this. Well, the next question is there might be an important story about why that is. Why we want some people who are so over the top with their love bonds. Why we have some folks who are more consistent. Same with risk taking. I used to work on dopamine genes and risk taking behavior, somewhat on sexual risk taking, but on other forms of risk too. And one argument, it's called frequency-dependent selection. One argument was you want some individuals who are going to go on the other side of the mountain. They're really risk-taking. They could find mates and food and resources and new land. They could also die. And so you want some individuals who are a little neophobic. They don't really go anywhere. Some who are really risk-taking, and then maybe a lot who are in the middle. And we see that in a whole host of species on a bunch of different behavioral dimensions.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, that if you're thinking about behavior through an evolutionary lens, it wouldn't be adaptive if everybody evolved to have the exact same, for example, mating strategy, because that's going to create more losers, essentially, if you will, from the standpoint of passing their genetic material along and so forth. Having different people have different strategies, or having mixed mating strategies creates more diversity and variability and more pathways to reproductive success.
Yeah, and increasingly, especially in the last few decades, evolutionary biologists in particular have really thought about the role of disease and environmental uncertainty as a selection pressure. So the other part of that is when we're all really similar on a trait, including biologically, if our immune systems are all really similar, if you have a new pathogen or you have a new environmental stressor, let's say there's a heavy, it was a really cold winter and you don't have as good food production, or there's a new predator, or there's a new anything, the uncertainty of the environment. If you're all the same, there's not that variation in a population to respond to it. So that invokes different ways of thinking about evolution, and that in evolutionary biology, we work on a lot of different theories. I think sometimes in the human sciences, we tend to focus in on a few of them, particularly in mating. We talk a lot about parental investment theory, but when you look at the biological studies, evolution is what's called a meta theory, and there's all these mid-level theories that are working on different things about genetic frequencies and behavioral frequencies and mating behaviors. And the part about disease and uncertainty, I'm really taken by, because I think back to this question of human pair bonding, not to pull us back there, that I think a lot of the adaptive purpose of pair bonding is to respond to uncertainty in our environment. Mm-hmm. That yes, it was for dual raising of offspring, but I think there's a bigger story of how our species has managed to respond to so much uncertainty, to so many different environments around the globe, that the pair bonds have, I truly believe, helped our species be so successful at that.
So something we're going to get into in greater depth in the next episode is what all of this means in terms of, we have these ancient mating systems that evolved a long time ago, but we have this new modern world that is very different than anything humans have previously experienced. And I think it begs the question of, how well do those mating systems serve us in today's world? Is it maybe why modern intimacy feels so confusing or unstable to so many people?
Yeah. Should I answer it now? Or yeah,
give me the brief answer now, and then we're going to really dive into it in the next episode.
Great. I think the brief answer is we are not necessarily adapted to our technological moment, but we are adaptable. So I think we're finding ways. Whether we're talking about dating apps, it's such a different mechanism of courtship than our ancestors engaged in, that we evolved with the types of information that we evolved to seek. But also the sheer amount of data that we can get. We're in such a different landscape as a species, and that impacts everything about our romantic and sexual lives. It impacts feelings of jealousy. It impacts attention. It's so easy, you're in a romantic relationship, to just be distracted by your phone, by your computer, by the TV, by the sheer amount of information we can, it's like, yes, honey, I'm interested in you, but I'm also learning about, the Cold War right now, and I'll talk to you later. But there's just anything is at our fingertips. That creates distractions in ways that are challenging for maintaining closeness, maintaining intimacy. And I think the big piece that we could talk more about is we are in a moment that we talk about the loneliness epidemic. We are in a moment that we have more connection than ever before in our species history, evolutionary history. But what is the depth of those connections? What is the quality? And that is, I think, where we're really struggling as a species. It's paradoxical that we could say, how are we lonely? We're more connected than ever before, but what is the quality and the depth? So I've argued in the book, in The Intimate Animal, I talk a little bit about this kind of intimacy crisis as a bigger umbrella that we can understand loneliness. Because how do you understand loneliness? It's not that we don't have people around us. Some people don't have anyone around them, but it's really the quality of those relationships.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, Justin. I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation in the next episode and diving further into the evolution of our sexuality. So can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book, The Intimate Animal?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. And so you can follow me at Dr. Justin Garcia on social media, but also we post things on the Kinsey Institute accounts. And The Intimate Animal is available everywhere, online and in bookstores. So it's available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, book lists. So you can catch it anywhere. And I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Also, thank you to my listeners. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on X and Blue Sky at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want, and Dr. Justin Garcia's book, The Intimate Animal. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.